my capstone, I decided to make an ecosystem in a jar and observe how it changed over 2 months. With 11 different animal species and only one aquatic plant species, a lot of things surprised me, and I'd like to share them here today. Last winter, I was thinking about what I should do for my capstone. Then I saw a YouTube video in my recommended about a self-sustaining ecosystem in a jar called a vivarium. Then I thought, hey, this looks pretty cool. I kinda want to do this. I could do this for my capstone. I'll fill a jar with water or dirt and record what I see for a couple months. I decided to go to Trout Lake and get the materials for a freshwater vivarium. It was raining and my hands were full, so I couldn't really film myself filling my jar with water and mud. The water level was about 30 centimeters above normal due to recent weather, so the only true aquatic plant I could get was a couple bits of duckweed, and all the other greenery was just leaves and a terrestrial plant. I drew a few weird looks, but there was a corgi race going on, so that put me in a better mood. I went home and took out my jar, only to see that it was just full of brown, nearly opaque water, and I couldn't see a thing. I expected there to be very little in terms of life within it. After about 3 days, the water fully cleared up and I could see most of the animal species that I would end up finding. These are detritus worms, meaning they feed on decaying organic material. They spent most of their time rooting around the substrate and are very common within the vivarium. There is another species of roundworm in this ecosphere, but they are predatory. They have bristles on their sides called setae that help with movement. They feed on small invertebrates and stay in the canopy or on the glass. There was one other roundworm species that I noticed, but I only saw it a couple times. I was never able to identify it and I think it died out. On the topic of unidentified organisms, there was some kind of arthropod that appeared to be stuck in the central plant. I assume it was an insect larva, but it died after 3 days of squirming. One of my favorite species in the vivarium is the planarian flatworm. They were the first animal to evolve a central nervous system and cephalization, the formation of a head. They feed on anything they can get their mouths on, and their mouths are on their bellies. Their population in the ecosphere started out with only 2 individuals. These are copepods. They're filter feeders that tend to stay in the water column and use their speed to stay away from predators. They're abundant in the ecosphere and can be found in almost every body of water on the planet. Another filter feeder that exists in abundance is Daphnia magna. Most of the individuals were carrying eggs when I brought them into the jar, and they produce a lot of babies very quickly. These are called ostracods. They're crustaceans like crabs and lobsters, but much smaller. They are omnivores that will eat whatever small organisms or organic matter they can find. They swim around or stay still on the glass most of the time. I'm not super confident on the identity of this species, but I believe they're another species of ostracod. They move in the same manner but are much larger, and seem to have distinct legs that they use to propel themselves. There are 2 species of snail within the vivarium, the larger being bladder snails. There was only one individual that was fully matured, and it was able to lay hundreds of eggs and start a population. Snails are hermaphroditic, meaning they have both sex organs, and some, like bladder snails, can reproduce asexually. Here you can see the adult grazing for algae on the glass. The other snail species is the ramshorn snail. They are smaller and reproduce more slowly. Both species climb on every underwater surface to scavenge for anything they can find. I wasn't confident about these organisms' identities, or even if one of them was alive or just a plant seed, but I believe these to be freshwater limpets. This one had a colony of Vorticella, a protozoan, growing out of it, and a hard surface is required for them to grow, so I deemed that this creature had a hard shell like a limpet. Limpets are mollusks, like snails, that are found in both salt and fresh water. I kept observing the jar, and after 2 months, a lot changed. The Daphnia produced a tremendous number of offspring. I estimate they peaked at over 100 individuals. But when I went away for 5 days, I came back to find that only a couple individuals remained. A few days later, they were extinct. The predatory roundworms followed a similar trend, peaking at over 30 individuals, but vanishing after my trip. The freshwater limpets went extinct as well, but due to their small population size, this is no surprise. This big central plant that is habitat for many life forms is terrestrial, but has survived submerged for over 2 months, even growing to the point where it has pushed itself down by pressing its top against the lid. The couple pieces of duckweed that I brought in had immense success, spreading across the entire surface and growing their roots down into the water column. I believe this change in habitat structure is what caused the demise of the Daphnia and predatory roundworms, as their main habitat was altered. The 2 flatworms multiplied gradually until they peaked at about 17 individuals. I can always see them prowling the glass, and I even caught one feeding on an ostracod. After the first 5 days, all the detritus worms gradually left the substrate and danced, for lack of a better term, on the bottom. They have been above the substrate ever since. One possible reason for this is the emergence of colorful algae in the substrate. This is apparently caused by an excess of light, and it is inaccessible to grazers such as the snails, and may have driven the worms out. Both snail species produced many offspring, but the bladder snails seem to be more successful. I learned that bladder snails are capable of controlling their buoyancy to allow them to ascend in the water without touching anything. This behavior has been observed before by aquarium keepers, but I couldn't find any formal research papers about it online. Through this project, I've learned how changes in an environment can affect its inhabitants, like how the duckweed affected the Daphnia and predatory roundworms, and how the algae affected the detritus worms. I further developed my skills of observation and analysis by recording qualitative and quantitative observations over 2 months and drawing conclusions from patterns in the data. I have linked the full 6,400-word document in the video description if you would like to take a look at it, but it's kind of a nightmare. Around the end of May, I found it challenging to stay motivated to record observations, as very little was changing. I ended up stopping on May 29th as I had completed my 2 months that I had set out to do. What I learned about myself is that my interest has its limits, and stagnation brings me close to them. The first time I saw the bladder snails ascending and the planarians feeding, I was ecstatic, but such moments only occurred within the first month. I still think the vivarium is cool, and I'd like to take it with me throughout my life, but for the foreseeable future, I don't think I'll be taking any more observations on it.